Hello, and welcome to my walkthrough of the History Channel's Civil War, A Nation Divided. I'm going through these levels chronologically, in the order they took place during the Civil War, not necessarily the order you'd play them in this game. Up next, we have the Battle of Chancellorsville.
One of the Union's brightest stars, General Hooker has a good plan to feint an attack on Lee at Fredericksburg, then march up the Rappahannock, cross the river, and attack Lee's rear. On April 30th, 1863, with 90,000 men, Hooker's main force reaches Chancellorsville. On May 2nd, Hooker stops his army when reaching Stonewall Jackson's troops. His officers urge him to press forward, but he delays. With 15,000 men, Lee keeps Hooker bottled up in the woods. Jackson leads the rest around the Union lines to attack their rear at Chancellorsville. Completely off guard, the Union troops fall back before darkness falls, desperately trying to ward off the attacking Southern forces.
Move closer, soldier. Your job is to take out those signal towers yonder. Shoot any snipers or guards on the way. Understood? You do that, and there's a bigger prize. The ammo depot at the end of the camp. I'm counting on you, boy.
Now, the Battle of Chancellorsville is probably my own personal favorite battle of the entire war. It's the one that I find the most fascinating. It's not so much well known amongst the general public, but it's very well known in military circles for people who like to study military strategy and leadership. This was General Lee's strategic masterpiece. Now, after being humiliated at Fredericksburg, General Ambrose Burnside had decided to launch another offensive at Fredericksburg just a month later in January, and that would go on to be remembered as the infamous Mud March. Right behind this signal tower is where the first secret area is, where we can pick up some grenades. Now, General Burnside took his troops out, and about 2 hours later it started to rain. And it didn't stop raining for 4 days straight. Thousands of soldiers marching on these dirt roads with mules and horses pulling wagons. It wasn't long before the dirt turned to mud, and it wasn't uncommon for the soldiers' boots to be pulled right off their feet, and for the wagons to get stuck in the mud all the way down to the spokes. There were scores of mules and horses who died of exhaustion and broke their backs trying to pull these wagons out of the mud. So 4 days in, this assault was completely called off. And after Fredericksburg and the Mud March, the morale amongst the Union soldiers was at an all-time low, and the desertion rate was at an all-time high. Now, on the other side of the Rappahannock, the Confederate Army was in a state of near starvation. It was so bad that General Lee had to send General Longstreet down south with his entire command to gather provisions. That's 20,000 soldiers that were not going to be present for this battle. And at this time, the Confederate Army was only about 62,000 strong, whereas the Union was 130,000 strong. That's a huge loss, 20,000 men going into this battle. But a lot of the Confederate soldiers were from the deep, deep South, meaning a lot of them had never even seen snow before. So they're starving, and they're freezing, sleeping in tents in the snow. So the armies on both sides of the war were in really bad shape up until this point. Now, after Fredericksburg and the Mud March, Abraham Lincoln had relieved General Ambrose Burnside of his command and had replaced him with General Joseph Hooker, who'd learned his lessons from the Battle of Fredericksburg well, that it was a fool's errand to run up against heavily fortified defensive positions. All that's going to accomplish is the slaughter of your own troops. So what he decided to do was to maneuver his men into a good defensive position and let the Confederates attack them. So he took 40,000 of his troops and marched them over the Rappahannock into Fredericksburg to fix Lee's troops into their set position, while at the same time he took the bulk of his army and maneuvered them in a huge wide arc so that the rebels couldn't see what they were doing and come up behind the Confederates and box them in this kind of vice. And by doing this, he figured one of two things would happen. Either the Confederates would be forced to leave the trenches and fight, which is a fight they certainly would have lost. They were boxed in on both sides and outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, or they'd be forced to retreat and fall back to Richmond. It took Robert E. Lee about 2 days to figure out what was going on. He knew the Union was there, but they weren't attacking. But once he figured it out, he sat down with his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, and they devised a plan. They decided that Jackson was going to take the entirety of his command and circle them around out west, come up behind the Union Army and attack them through Chancellorsville. Take all 3 of his divisions. And by doing this, he would leave Lee in Fredericksburg with only 2 divisions to fend off the entire Union Army. Now, why would he do this? I mean, that sounds completely insane, right? Well, not really, because for those 2 days, the Confederates could hear digging in the woods and the chopping down of trees, and they weren't attacking, which is a clear sign that they were setting up strong defensive positions. It was pretty obvious that what Hooker was trying to do was make Lee sweat until he was forced to make a move. And the funny thing is while Jackson's divisions were circling around, they were actually spotted several times doing this, and that only led the Union to believe that they were in fact retreating, which was Hooker's plan the entire time. Jackson was able to hit the Union on their weakest flank out to the west through Chancellorsville and completely catch them by surprise. The reason why General Hooker put his weakest flank out to the west is because that isn't where the battle was supposed to be. It was supposed to happen in Fredericksburg. Now, there was a lot of debate then on both sides, and there still is to this day. There were a lot of people on both sides of the war who believed that the strength in war was in the defense, that the new weapons that were available in the Civil War always gave the defense the advantage, while others believed that the real strength is in the offense. Because whoever is on the offense has the initiative. They're the ones who are really calling the shots. They're the ones who determine where the battle's going to be, when the battle's going to take place, and under what conditions the battle's going to occur. The reason why General Lee was able to take the initiative is because Hooker led him. He ordered his troops to sit there and wait for the rebels to attack. They had caught the Union completely by surprise, and that night, as the sun went down, Stonewall Jackson didn't want to stop fighting. He actually took 2 of his staff officers out to scout ahead. And when he came back, they were mistaken for the enemy, and all 3 of them were shot by friendly fire, which effectively took Stonewall Jackson out of the battle completely. And the next day, General Joseph Hooker was actually wounded too. The Confederates had found where his headquarters was. It was a small building called Chancellor House. They opened fire on this house and knocked down a support beam, which came crashing down right on top of Hooker and knocked him out for a few hours. Now, today, we would understand that he'd suffered a concussion. But back then, because there was no blood, and he was up walking around, all of his men thought that he was okay. When it was pretty clear throughout the rest of the battle that his judgment had been severely impaired by this injury. A lot of the commands he was giving over the next couple days were extremely confusing. He missed opportunities where he could have easily flanked the Confederates. His army still outnumbered the rebels by more than 2 to 1 here. That it was so bad that rumors had started and continued after the war that he was drunk during this battle, which he was not. He'd suffered a severe concussion. Okay, so we shot our way through this camp, and we have to sabotage this over here. And straight ahead, this is actually over to the right from where we were coming. This is where our next objective is. Find your commanding officer.
Listen up, 'cause I don't got long. there's an ammo depot just beyond them trees. Best thing is to hit it from the other side. You set fire to them trees and blow it up. Now, don't mind me. I'm going to a good place. Now get!
And directly in front of him is the next secret area, where there will be a med pack if you need it. Now, on the 6th, at midnight, General Hooker had called for a council of war, and he asked his corps commanders to vote whether they should advance or withdraw, and the decision was ultimately made to retreat. While at the same time, Robert E. Lee was planning an all-out offensive at sunrise. He was going to put it all on the line again, even though his numbers, again, he was severely outnumbered. Not knowing that by the time the sun came up, the Union Army was going to be gone. There was going to be no army to attack. And again, this goes down in history again as Robert E. Lee's strategic masterpiece. But he was extremely disappointed by this outcome. For one, the rebels had managed to get away again, and he really hadn't gained an inch of ground. He lost 13,000 men in this battle, 12 of his brigade commanders, and Stonewall Jackson succumbed to pneumonia just a couple days later. He really hadn't gained anything, but he'd lost so much. And again, the Union had managed to slip away in the middle of the night. Now, it's just my own personal opinion, but I think if Stonewall Jackson had not died during this battle, the rest of the war would have been completely different. That's not to say the Confederacy would have ultimately won, but up until this point, the rebels were on a roll. They had won more battles than they had lost, and the leadership amongst the Union was looking pretty incompetent. They were making mistakes, bad mistakes, one right after another. Oh, and something else I wanted to mention. If you'll notice in the menu screen, in the beginning of this level, it says that this level is supposed to take place on April 4th, 1863. That date is wrong. The Battle of Chancellorsville took place between April 28th and May 6th. So I'm pretty sure what they meant to say was May 4th. 1863, but that kind of surprises me because that's not a small error. For the most part, this game has been pretty historically accurate. For the most part, and I'm surprised that that slipped through. I don't know if you noticed, but in this level, they only have your boys come help you when you really don't need them. When we were going through those camps and we're vastly outnumbered ourselves, where were our guys? Alright, gotcha. Okay, right around the corner over here. This is the last explosive barrel that we have to detonate, but right around the side. This is where you'll find the secret document for this level. It's right towards the end. So if Billy is still alive, he can have my books and all my personal objects, like my clothes and such. I know he's been hankering after my horses and pigs and my pipe collection, and he can have those too. When you get this, it means I've gone to the Lord. I hope he will receive me. Alright, again, I hope I've done some amount of justice to this battle in the short time I had allotted to me. But the battle after this is Gettysburg. And thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you next time.
Because of the late attack, Jackson doesn't have time to finish the job. He rides after the retreating Yankees, considering a night assault. When he returns, confused Confederate sentries mistake him for the enemy. 2 of Jackson's aides are killed, and he's shot twice in the arm. The limb has to be amputated. The next day, Hooker orders a retreat, and the Union Army crosses back over the Rappahannock. The defeat is total. Hooker loses 17,000 men. It's Lee's costliest victory to date. He loses 13,000 men, including his best general. On May 10, 1863, Stonewall Jackson takes a turn for the worst and dies of pneumonia.